corner of 87th Avenue and Kelton Lane. Do any commissioners have any questions or comments about any of the items before us tonight on the consent agenda?
Mr. Chair, on the minutes, there was a question asked, and it was not asked by Chairman Hutchinson, but by Chairman Nelson.
Oh, good catch.
I'm proving that I read the packet.
Very impressive.
Okay.
I missed that. Thank you for that. All right, duly
I'd like to
noted.
make a motion as amended.
All right. Very good. All right, thank you for that.
I'd like to make a motion as amended.
And do I have a second?
I'll second that.
All right, thank you. We have a motion, a second, to approve tonight's consent agenda as amended. Those in favor say aye.
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 And those opposed? And the consent agenda passes unanimously. Thank you, Commissioners. We're going to move on to the regular agenda now. We have 3 items before us tonight. The first item is item 4R, Haciendas at White Peak. Stipulation modification Z1732A.1. Withy Morris PLC is requesting a modification to condition of approval number 4 of case Z17-32, ordinance 2018-27 of the approved rezoning for the Haciendas at White Peak subdivision. The proposed modification of the condition would allow for potential alternative roadway dedications and improvements for the subdivision, subject to the approval of the city engineer. With that, staff, will you please present your report?
Good evening, Chairman Nelson and Commissioners. I'm Amanda Beck, planner with the department, and I will be giving the staff report on item 4R, the Haciendas at White Peak stipulation modification for case C17-32A.1. Excuse me. The applicant for this request is Jason Morris with Withy Morris PLC on behalf of the property owner and developer. As you can see on screen, the subject site is located in the north of Peoria, west of Trilogy East, where the future alignments of 135th Avenue and Morning Vista Lane meet. Just for clarification, Morning Vista Lane is what was formerly the alignment for Ridgeline Road. Just to keep everyone on their toes, while this is a rezoning case, I do want to highlight that this is a very specific case. It is just for the stipulation modification to the approved rezoning case, and nothing outside of that scope would be touched. So the applicant is requesting to modify condition of approval number 4 of ordinance 2018-27 for the rezoning of Z17-32, the Haciendas at White Peak PAD. As I previously stated, the scope of this is very specific. No modifications will be made to the entitlement for the PAD. Only the language concerning the stipulation is under consideration. As a refresher on the entitlement, it is for 152 single-family homes with a gross density of 2.5 dwelling units per acre. So on screen, you'll see a side-by-side of the language for the existing condition of approval number 4, which is on the left, and the proposed language by the applicant on the right. Their language is highlighted in red. The request is to allow the developer the flexibility to meet city requirements for site improvements and secondary access for the subdivision. This flexibility will allow them to move forward with the pre-plat and civil engineering steps. Later in the presentation, I will discuss recommendations for the language for the conditions of approval per staff recommendation. Understanding this case requires looking at the disposition of the surrounding properties at the time of approval for Z17-32. The changes to the development landscape in this part of the city have changed significantly since the original approval. As you can see on this context map, the subject site is bordered on all sides by undeveloped properties currently. East of the alignment of 135th Avenue is Trilogy West. Directly east of the site is a 10-acre privately owned parcel that is not a part of the PAD. And then west are 2 5-acre parcels that are also not a part of the PAD. But as you can see, there we go. The northern 5-acre piece is currently under review by staff for rezoning for that 5-acre piece. And then south of the future Morning Vista Lane is a proposed 280-acre rezoning, which is the Cowley property here. Excuse me. Since the Hacienda's rezoning was approved, a minor general plan amendment and rezoning case for the Cali property is under review by staff, and we think it does impact the potential for circulation in the area and warrants consideration in regard to the stipulation modification. So, as originally conceived, the development had 2 points of access from Morning Vista Lane, which with the original was called Ridgeline Road, which was required to be a 90-foot right-of-way, which would ensure ingress and egress for emergency services should there be an accident while allowing people to go in and out of the subdivision. They were required to dedicate, or they will be required to dedicate 50 feet of right-of-way for all local roads internal to the subdivision, 55 feet for Dixoletta Drive, which would be the northern border for the subdivision, which would be half street improvements. And then now, after working through with staff, they would be dedicating 60 feet of right-of-way for Morning Vista Lane, which will be full street dedication. The potential for secondary access has changed with the Cali rezoning, and the potential for that secondary access, thanks to the Cali rezoning, is why staff is recommending a new condition of approval, which was included in the packet, the revised Exhibit 1. So just as a point of clarification, city staff review a rezoning on its own merit to ensure the necessary improvements are completed for that development, regardless of other developments in the area. That's to ensure that all city requirements for access, landscaping, health and safety, all of those requirements are met regardless of what should happen with surrounding development. The original conditions of approval reflect this stance, but rather than review developments as static in time when new adjacent cases are submitted, it's a chance for the city to review to work with developers to find smarter ways for proposed developments to move forward. You'll see on screen, this is the conceptual for the Cali rezoning, and they are trying to incorporate the Hacienda's access points in their design to ensure there's not interlocking left turns, but also in the future, Haciendas might be able to use this Cali local street as a point of access for circulation or emergency services. Several big items have changed since the Hacienda's approval happened in 2018. The general plan circulation map was updated that had some significant changes. Dixoletta Parkway was renamed Ridgeline Road, and the alignment now turns north to meet 135th Avenue. Morning Vista Lane, formerly Ridgeline Road, was changed from a future arterial to a major collector, and a future major arterial heading west from 135th Avenue is anticipated, which will be Dixoletta Drive. That would be the northern border for the subdivision. The original requirement to dedicate 90 feet of right-of-way was because there was no other development which could provide secondary access in this area. As you can see on screen, it's outside of any existing infrastructure for roadways. Evaluating this circulation given all the new proposals, city staff has determined access on Morning Vista Lane can be served by a 60-foot right-of-way, dependent on Haciendas providing secondary access for the subdivision. These shifts in the circulation plan and the adjacent rezonings have prompted the new condition, which staff is recommending, just to ensure that there isn't a stall, if you will, on development because of trying to figure out secondary access when coordinating with the other developments in the area. Staff believes this condition allows the developer flexibility to meet the city's minimum requirements and allows them to finish their pre-plat, which has been under review, but we're waiting to finalize where that access will be and then go on to civil engineering plans. But also the language of this particular condition allows the same flexibility. We don't want to dictate how the requirements are met in the case that for whatever reason when it comes down to engineering plans that needs to be changed. They would have to come back again to modify the language, which we don't want them to have to do. This case was noticed according to city requirements. Site has been posted and an ad was placed in the newspaper. Staff has received no opposition. I did receive correspondence from a property owner within the notification radius asking for details on the case, just to understand what it entailed better. Staff's key findings for this case are that the requested stipulation modification is the minimum necessary for the development to finalize the pre-plat and the civil engineering plans. Additionally, staff recommend the new condition of approval number 7 be added to ensure, in whatever the way the requirement is met, that secondary access for the subdivision be provided. Staff recommend that the additional condition of approval number 7 be added to the stipulation modification given the changes in the developments around haciendas. Additionally, you will see the language in Exhibit 1 that staff recommended updating the language of the conditions to reflect the new names of the right-of-ways and also the reduced right-of-way for Morning Vista Lane. To accommodate an additional request by the applicant, staff have provided the memo distributed this evening, updating the language for condition of approval number 7. You'll see their addition highlighted in red on screen. The applicant's requested language is both agreeable to them and staff. So with that, Mr. Chairman, this concludes my report. I'm here to answer any questions, and the applicant is also present.
Great, thank you for that report, appreciate it. Do any commissioners have any questions of Ms. Beck? Going once, going twice? All right. I'm going to declare the public meeting open. Is the applicant present tonight? Do you wish to speak?
I do.
Terrific.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Please state your name and address for the record.
Certainly. Jason Morris, Withy Morris, on behalf of the applicant. I have to compliment staff. Ms. Beck did a thorough job in explaining everything, so I will be very brief. I actually have some slides. Ms. Beck has taken all of my best lines, so this will be very, very brief. In essence, it's a change in circumstance, as was referenced. This 60 acres, it was a year ago this month that the mayor and council approved this case. To be clear and to reiterate, thank you, to reiterate what was already said, this is not a change in the underlying zoning. It is not a change in the land use plan. It doesn't permit a single additional lot, and it doesn't change the overall site plan that was associated with this case a year ago when it was approved by Planning Commission and then subsequently by council. What has changed was the development that has occurred around this site. When we originally came in, now keep in mind, if this was approved last year in August by council, it means that we started planning this probably 2.5 years ago. And at that time, as we looked at what was surrounding this property, and certainly as the city of Peoria looked at it, there was not a contiguous roadway system that could act independently. Subsequent to that, and obviously you're aware because you see the planning and zoning cases, this is a very vibrant area in terms of land use. Other development cases have occurred in the area. As we look at the site plan, that is the conceptual site plan from last year. Again, no changes to that are anticipated as a result of this request. But because of the change in the roadway system in the area, and this exhibit really sums it up, you have development occurring and other developers who are interested in the continuation of the land use and the transportation plan. The city's transportation planners have gotten ahead of this issue and have recognized it's no longer this applicant's requirement and really burden to create the entire roadway just from their property, which was, at the time, an analysis that was done with no other development occurring around it. So it made sense given the context, but the context has changed tremendously. As we look at the right-of-way and the proposed stipulation, really the change that we are requesting is simply to allow the city engineer to have the flexibility moving forward to recognize that the roadway system is changing. And why we're doing this is really to some degree unique to Peoria. This zoning case had stipulations associated with it, which is similar to every other case that you'll see. In other jurisdictions, oftentimes they have a process that specifically allows you to amend stipulations. Depending upon the jurisdiction, they have different processes, but you can go in and you can request just a change to the stipulations, and you run that ultimately. It's, you know, I'll use the City of Phoenix, for example. That's probably a 30-day process. The City of Peoria doesn't have an analogous procedure, but what they've done in this instance is they have run what amounts to a rezoning case, but it's focused just on the stipulations, and they've done it in an incredibly timely manner, which we appreciate because, as you can imagine, this was a year ago it was zoned. All of these things happened in the interim, and there's development occurring in the area. We would like to move forward. This, although it's a slight change, it's significant in terms of our development. Allowing the city engineer to have that flexibility and to right-size the roadways in the right areas really allows this project to move forward, and it also accommodates the future rezonings that you'll see in the area. So I'll because Ms. Beck did such a good job, I'll stop there. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you for that. Do any commissioners have any questions of the applicant? Nope.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Ms. Ernst, do we have any speaker request forms on this item? Okay, thank you. All right, then I'm going to go ahead and close the public hearing. Any further questions or comments from any commissioners before we take action on this item? All right, seeing none, may I have a motion? Anybody care to make a motion?
No.
Oh, Joanna? Commissioner Condit.
Chairman Nelson, I'd like to make a motion that we approve the item 4R Haciendas. Am I in the right place?
Yes.
At White Peak stipulation modification C1732A1 to go on to the City Council.
Thank you, Commissioner Condit. We have a motion on the table. Do we have a second?
Second?
All right.
Yeah.
Commissioner Alsop seconded it. I think you spoke first. All those in favor?
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry,
Oh,
just real quick, before you take the vote.
Yes.
I just wanted to clarify that the motion includes the language that we presented tonight, the revised stipulations, including number 7 as well.
Oh, do we need to
So-
restate the motion? Would you prefer we do that? Would you care to restate the motion with that feedback, Commissioner
Okay,
Condit?
all right. We'll try this again. Okay, motion to approve item 4R Haciendas at White Peak stipulation modification Z17-32A.1 with the language as presented in this evening's meeting.
Is that
Okay.
suitable? All right, thank you. All right, may I have a motion?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Alsop. All right, we have a motion and a second on the table. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? And the motion carries unanimously. Thank you, Commissioners. All right, we're going to move on to item 5R. This is a presentation by Mr. David Benton with the City Attorney's Office on the Arizona Open Meeting Law. I believe this is informational only and no action will be taken tonight. Mr. Benton, you have the floor.
I've been requested to give a brief, very brief presentation on the open meeting law, just to give everybody a reminder of the responsibilities not only of the members of this body, but what the open meeting law is really for. Yeah, that's what I wanted. This makes me feel better. As everyone knows, all the open meeting law statutes are in Title 34, Chapter 3, Article 3.1, and it really is focused on just a few particular statutory subsections, which I'm going to talk about this evening. And this is a several thousand foot kind of presentation. It really is to prompt you guys to start asking questions and really kind of understand your roles as a members of an open meeting and as a public body that is subject to the open meeting law. So you guys are definitely a public body. I'm sure you've known that for quite some time. And all persons desired can attend these kinds of meetings and speak and listen. So that specific language is there for a reason, because I'll come back to that, why people are allowed to attend and listen that doesn't necessarily mean they are allowed to speak. Those aren't in the statute. When we come across this question, am I subject to the open meeting law, we typically say an appointed body by a governmental entity is almost automatically subject to the open meeting law. Sometimes that appointment comes into question. Was it really appointed? Is it just a gathering? What kind of meetings are open to subject to the open meeting law? My advice is always just err on the side of openness. Just act like you're an open meeting, and you will likely not get in trouble for that. If you don't act like an open meeting and you weren't, you can really undermine all the good work you've done. But you guys don't have that problem. You guys have been subject to the open meeting law from the very beginning. But I just like to impart that kind of idea upon just about everybody so that you're just consistently reminded that what you do is open to the public and available to their scrutiny. So what's a meeting? This is very important too, because meetings are determined by what you do and how you act, and if there's a quorum and so forth and so on. You can take action, legal action, in a meeting, but you can still have a meeting without taking legal action. So gathering in person through technological devices. I gave this presentation to the Youth Advisory Board, and so that phrase is very important to them because they use all kinds of technologies. So they had a lot of questions about, am I in a meeting if I do X, Y, and Z on Instagram or FaceWeb or whatever they do. So it's a quorum of members. Obviously, a quorum is 50 plus 1 at a public body where they discuss, propose, and take legal action. Take legal action has a legal definition as well as a legal impact, including any deliberations by the quorum with respect to such action. So if you guys are a quorum, a quorum of you is 4, but does that mean only that 3 of you cannot have a meeting? Absolutely, you can have a meeting with 3. You just cannot take legal action. So you only can take legal action with a quorum. As I mentioned before, you clearly a public body. All appointed boards and commissions of the council are subject to the open meeting law. As I mentioned before, a quorum that's the only way you can take legal action. For instance, had there only been 3 of you, you couldn't have approved the stipulation that was before you, for example. You could have discussed it, you could have talked about it, you could have asked staff about it, you could have had, hey, staff, do some more research, but you couldn't do nothing else other than that. You couldn't have approved it, and approval is what you do. You make recommendations to city council, and they scrutinize your recommendations, and ultimately there's a legislative decision based on your legal action at this level. Oops, I keep lifting the wrong one. Public notices, something that you guys really have to worry about. It's really transparent, but it's very important that these notices be put out. Agendas are really important to you, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Can you have a meeting without a 24-hour advance notice? Of course you can. If there's an emergency, and emergencies are usually dependent upon the circumstances, but I've been doing this kind of work for 20 years, and I've never had an emergency meeting. So it's very rare, but I've heard other jurisdictions, you have to have them depending on what happened that morning. Something could happen that morning, the board, the council, somebody needs to take legal action. So it's certainly conceivable that emergencies happens, but I've just never been involved in one. So we talk about the agenda, items for discussion and legal action, and this is what's very important. What's not in the agenda, you really can't talk about. And it seems simple, and it seems like, well, of course, you can't talk about it not in the agenda, but oftentimes I have run into this. Sometimes things outside the meeting kind of come in. People could make a comment. A member of the board could have a thought, and something on the agenda prompts you in another direction, and it just takes the whole commission to talk about that. somebody's on their phone and they're researching, on their computer and they're researching, and they bring some information that wasn't on the agenda, that shouldn't be discussed, and can't be considered by the public. Because remember, you're a board in which the public can attend and listen. The agenda was put up to tell the public what you were going to talk about. So if the public doesn't know what you're going to talk about because you're not talking about something on the agenda, that's a violation of the open meeting law. We can have a problem with that. And so it's easy to do, but it's hard to kind of conceptualize outside of an actual meeting. I have been in plenty of meetings where the whole board or commission has just gone off topic. And it's kind of natural, you know, it's not a bad thing, but it's clearly not unusual because, you know, when you're doing your job, something else comes up, you want to talk about it, and you just kind of go on a tangent. So it's my job, it's staff's job to say, hey, wait a minute, time out, we really can't talk about that. It's not on the agenda. However, we'll be happy to put it on the next agenda and you can talk about it all you want. Even if you're not going to take any legal action on such item, if the item's not the agenda, you really can't talk about it. And it is the function of the 24-hour notice, as well as the notification that there's a meeting, as well as the construct of the agenda that gives the public not only the right to listen and attend, but participate if they need to. Meeting minutes is important. Clearly, we all take care of that. It's a record of your discussion and legal actions taken. And this is a list of the things that must be in there. Sometimes this comes up when our members, either of a board or someone who's attended the meeting, wanted to know what happened a year ago. And they ask a whole bunch of questions and who said what and how did they vote, and I don't think that's what happened, and so forth and so on. So it's kind of important to read the minutes because it is a record of what you've done and who's done it. Thank you, Commissioner Hutchison, for reading the packet and correcting that. Those kind of things kind of matter, and kudos. Executive session, we've had a couple here. It's an exception to the rule, and the exception is it's closed to the public. Not that all the other stuff doesn't apply, because all the other stuff does apply. We have to do all those other things just as well. Just because the public's there, we can't talk about something that's not in the agenda. Again, it's easier to get off topic. Nobody's watching. What's the problem? The problem is it's illegal, you know. We can only have executive sessions for statutory reasons, and there's a list of them. So we just can't talk about anything we want to in executive session. There's only a list of things you can talk about in executive session. And I help boards kind of navigate that. Usually you hear, well, we don't really want to have the public involved in this yet. Well, that's what you do. You know, you're a public body, the public can be involved. So we really can't not talk about it in public if it's not one of the statutory reasons that allows you to go in executive session. And so it can be frustrating, but it's just the way it is. We take minutes, but obviously it's executive session. It's confidential. One of the other things about executive session that the attorneys are repeatedly reminded of is that it's called an admonition. The admonition really is, you're in executive session, you guys can't talk about what you talked about in executive session. Because not only can you violate the open meeting law, but you can ruin the attorney-client privilege and therefore expose everything you said in executive session to public scrutiny. And clearly that's not what you want, because that's the reason why you went into executive session in the first place. So it's problematic. It can be problematic, and I've been in situations where it turned really, really bad. Like you saw it in the press the next day. It can be really bad. Call to the public. So I bring this up only because I mentioned before, the statute allows anybody to attend and listen. And listen means in any way. Television, radio, on your phone, internet, we can stream this, Instagram. We probably can't listen on Instagram, can you? Yeah, you probably can. Anyway, there's other ways you allow the public. So if everyone called in You know, you guys are scattered across the country and no one can actually be here. We can set up a phone here, everybody can call in, and people can sit there and listen to the meeting. The other question is, well, what if I want to call and listen to the meeting? I'm not in the state too. Absolutely, you sure can. So we'd have to set it up so other people could listen in to what's going on. That's attending and listening. Now, do you have to listen to people when they come to these meetings? Well, of course you should. I mean, that's the point of having these meetings. But do you have to? Does the statute require you? It does not. So I've been in plenty meetings where we just went through the agenda, even though it was an audience full of people who wanted to speak, and we didn't let them. It's really not my decision, it's really the chairperson's decision. And if we don't want to hear public testimony, you don't have to take it. So it's completely up to you. That translates into, you can control it if you don't want, usually it's 3 minutes here, I've heard 5 minutes, I've heard 10 minutes, depending on what the circumstances are. You can go beyond the 3 minutes, or you can cut somebody off at 1, or you can say, okay, we don't need to hear from you, we've already heard from you, let somebody else talk about something else that would help us. That's why those kinds of authorities are in the chairman's or chairperson's hands, because the statute doesn't require you to hear people talk. But almost every public body allows people to talk. I haven't heard one who doesn't. Everybody does it. So what happens when people start talking, helping you, putting their input? I mean, I think that's what you want. You want to hear what constituents care about, what neighbors care about, what business owners care about. You want to hear about all that stuff, but sometimes somebody just wants to blow off steam and they start pointing fingers and accusing members of not doing anything in public, and criticizing staff, and attacking their wonderful lawyer and those kinds of things. It's just, you know, your favorite lawyer, that's correct. So what could you do then? Actually, the statute allows you to respond to those kinds of things. Because remember, what most people talk about are probably not on the agenda, because their comments, or even if they're related to a particular item, what they're talking about most times isn't on the agenda. So you guys really can't talk about it. You have to sit and listen. So sitting and listen means, hey, we hear you, staff, help us at the next meeting, or help us understand that. You certainly say that, but you really can't respond to this person who's talking to you about some item. Now, if that person's criticizing you and saying bad things about you, you can certainly say something about the criticism, but that's it. It really is narrowly tailored to say, to have you don't have to sit there and take it. That's basically what the law is saying. But you are restricted to talking about only things on the agenda. Current events is another thing that is quite frankly, a little confusing. The Attorney General has an agency handbook and gives a really horrible explanation about how to do this. It's really bad. So I can tell you, attorneys are always confused about what this actually means. Even if you read the statute, it's really not clear. So members of staff, you know, what is a current event? When can you talk about that current event? Can you discuss that current event? How is it supposed to be laid out on the agenda? If it's laid out one way, can you talk about it this way? If it's laid out another way, you only can talk about it that way. It really is an unclear way that the open meeting law has been constructed. But basically, current events are only talk about members, you're the members, staff, or the public. You know, you can talk about those kinds of things. Relevant events and matters that are not on the agenda, such as visiting a site. That's going to be on the agenda. Okay, relevant. Can you talk about it any more than saying I'm going to visit? No. Can you say I have an opinion and I think I'm going to vote this way next time when this comes before the board? Please don't do that. That would be awful. Staff usually gives calendar updates and those kinds of things. Can I give a staff update? Absolutely not. Statute won't let me to do it because I'm not named. So I can't give you an update. Can Chris give you an update? Absolutely. Can Lori give you an update? I don't know. I don't think the statute's quite clear, because it talks about a director position. So you would think only Chris can give you updates, but that's really not how we're interpreting it. So can anybody in planning and zoning just come along and say, I'm gonna give updates? I think we can say no, because of the way the statute's drafted. So we've concluded people in leadership positions can do that kind of thing. Obviously, you as members of the commission can do that kind of thing. And so that's how we're kind of narrowly interpreting the way the statute's drafted. So going back to the technology, this is where the non-compliance issues usually come up. We always start with don't reply all. Actually, there's no law against that. That's not what the law says. It's just horrible practice and could be scrutinized that you're having a meeting without complying with the open meeting law. Because if you reply all, depending on what you say, if you reply all, yes, I'll be there, not a violation. If you reply all, I agree with what you said, that's a problem, because it appears if you made a decision without actually having a meeting. So we just tell everybody, just don't do it. It's easy. And it's easy for us, it's easy for staff, it's easy for you. The point is, it could be looked at as circumventing the open meeting law. Discussions that splinter the quorum. She calls you, you call him, then you call her about what is going to be on the agenda in 2 weeks. Probably shouldn't do that. Probably you should just call staff. You're not really talking about something specific to which you might make a legal action, but the appearance is you're trying to get around the quorum because 4 of you has talked about what's going to happen at a meeting. All right. So she calls Sean, and Sean calls Joanne back. Probably not a problem. I mean, there's no way to construe it's going to be a quorum. Even if you two want to talk about something that might be on an agenda because you know more about it than he does, it's probably okay. But you really want to refrain from doing these things like that because things like that snowball. You know, you really can't help from kind of extending that practice because you know somebody else is going to call somebody else and somebody else is going to call somebody else. It just happens. So we always recommend just don't do that. It's easier to call staff and somebody else, and we'll be happy to talk about anything you want to talk about. That was a example of a serial discussion. Sometimes quorums can be separate quorums can be created in another way. 3 of you go to visit a site before the next meeting, and then a 4th one shows up. Hey, I didn't know you were going to be here. Hi, well, hey, what's this all about? Well, I think that's a quorum, clearly. It wasn't meant to be a quorum. You didn't plan on being a quorum, but it's a quorum in every sense of the word. It appears that you guys are having a meeting. You guys could be making legal decisions and legal action. None of that's probably going to happen, but it sure looks that way. It really looks bad. Splintering is another thing that I've seen in the past where people get on emails, daisy chains, phone calls. You could accidentally create a quorum on a Facebook post because of streaming. I've seen that happen. So it's unfortunate that all this stuff is happening all at the same time. All these technologies are happening all at the same time in the midst of open meeting law, who never considered any of this, but we're adjusting all the time. This is just a quick synopsis of what could happen. I've been involved in an investigation in an alleged open meeting law violation. These things are investigated thoroughly, although oftentimes there's really no offenses. I have never seen anybody get kicked out of office, but I've seen some really bad, in-depth, bad violations where there's been some in-depth investigations in it, and the Attorney General's office takes it very seriously, so we take it very seriously. Just really quickly, a little bit about ethics and conflicts of interest. We want to make sure that everybody understands that as elected and appointed officials, the ethics policy of the city applies to you. So if you haven't seen it, I'll be happy to send it to you. It really is, the purpose is to make sure everybody gets fair treatment. What really comes up in your context the most is any kind of potential remote or substantial interest you might have in the outcome of a case that's before you. So your responsibility really is to let us know. Just ask. Where I used to work, we just got everybody in the habit. Hey, I have a neighbor who might be involved in this so-and-so and so-and-so. Could that be a conflict of interest? The answer is no, obviously, but that's the habit we want to get everybody in. Just ask, because more often than not, you'll discover that there's no conflict and no need to disclose it. It's better if we just kind of talk through all the details. I've been involved in plenty of these where they've had a substantial interest and never disclosed it. And that's a real problem. It really doesn't undermine your action. It could, but oftentimes it doesn't. It just taints it from all the way down the line. It just makes it all look bad. So it's so much easier to just say. And disclosure doesn't mean you can't participate either. You can certainly participate in the discussion, even if you disclose there might be an interest. So those two things aren't mutually exclusive. You might be really interested in something and really want to participate, only to realize that your in-law is going to make a ton of money out of this if we go one way or another. Well, you have to disclose that, and likely you'll be recused from that, but that isn't always the case. So it's so much easier to just talk about it. Any questions?
Thank you. Terrific presentation. I always get a few nuggets out of this, so thank you for that. Commissioners, Linda, Commissioner Grice.
Yes, I would like to just get specific. When we have a general plan meeting off-site and 4 of us show up at that and we go, what was that about? Did you, blah, 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 blah. Are we having a meeting?
Well, we're having a meeting at an off-site that's been noticed. We have an agenda out, and we're talking about the general plan. Are you just talking about visiting a site? Oh, a community meeting.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, a community meeting. Okay, I misunderstood. Oh, I get it. Are you having a meeting? No, you're not having a meeting. That's not a meeting. I could tell you this. I have been involved in very cautious boards where they say, is anyone going to be coming to this award dinner? And we'll post it. It has been done, and it depends on what's going on, depending on the scrutiny with which the board is under. Is it likely that the entire commission is going to show up at something? It's always easy to post it. That would be my advice. You don't have to, because the law says the meeting is for this purpose, to be discussing these things. If you're just at a community meeting amongst yourselves, you're not going to be discussing anything. You're not going to be taking legal action. You're just talking about what's in front of you. So technically, that's not a violation of the open meeting law. The other side of that is it's just easy to post it.
And if I may chime in, we have had a number of meetings, and every time that there's been a general plan open house or any of the community meetings, we, as staff, do post a possible quorum through the city clerk's office. And it's regardless of whether it's Planning and Zoning Commission, Historic Preservation Commission, City Council, so forth. So across the board, we make sure every time we have a neighborhood meeting, open house, and that kind of forum, that we do post at the clerk's office of possible quorum at that location.
So if there's a zoning case and the developer, whoever's, has their community or neighborhood meeting, and let's say 3 or 4 of us live kind of in the area, or we're interested in it, and we show up at that, kind of a different scenario. How's that?
Again, you're not meeting there to conduct any legal business. I mean, you weren't there to talk about any agenda. It's the applicant's meeting. It's not a planning meeting. And if 4 of you show up just to listen, that's perfectly fine. I don't have a problem with that at all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Grace. Great question. Any other questions for Mr. Benton? Commissioner Condi?
We've had a number of meetings, you know, where they have, like, what was going to happen to Old Town, and then 4 of us would show up. So it's now that we know that they've been posted, nothing to worry about. Okay, conflict of interest, my question was, if something's happening in my neighborhood that could affect the value of my house, is that a conflict of interest? Or is that one of the reasons I'm on the commission, because I live in the city of Peoria, and everything affects our value? So a little bit extra information on that.
Sure. Statute informs us there's substantial interests and there's remote interests. Both of those are defined. Substantial interests you have to disclose, and substantial interests are usually money or some kind of benefit. Those are really easy. Remote interests is like a list of 10 of them, and one of them is if you're part of a professional organization, you know, you're just a member. I can't think of another one. If you're at a job, you know, part of your job is in that is being affected by that case. Like if you're working at Intel with the other 10,000 people, you're being affected, but it's not you. Those are examples of remote interests. So what you've just described is clearly a remote interest. You just live in the neighborhood, and you don't have to disclose remote interests. But as I mentioned before, you wouldn't know that unless you kind of talk through it. So that comes right up out of my mind automatically. That's remote. You don't have to worry about that. But unless you talk about that and just kind of discuss it, you wouldn't know that.
Thank you. All right, any other questions? Going once, twice? Great, thank you very much. Very informative. Appreciate you taking the time to do that. All right, we're going to move on to item 6R next. This is a staff briefing and possible discussion related to the city's traffic management practices, which will be followed by a tour of the Traffic Management Center. I understand Mr. Brandon Forey will be presenting tonight. Mr. Forey, the floor is all yours.
Good evening, Chairperson Nelson and members of the Commission. Thank you for giving this opportunity to speak before you. I'm going to get a chance to talk to you a little bit about what traffic engineering does in its entirety. Very briefly, we are a small group of 6 individuals led by our traffic engineer, Chris Lemke. I am over, as the assistant city traffic engineer, over what I like to call the unplugged portions of traffic engineering, anything that doesn't require electricity. And Steve McKenzie, our ITS engineer, is over the technology, ITS meaning Intelligent Transportation Systems. So one of the things that we do is at the early stages, we want to look at development and growth as it pertains to transportation in both private development as well as city-sponsored capital improvements projects, program projects. When we're reviewing these plans, we want to look at not only vehicular transportation, but we also want to look at all modes of transportation, including transit, pedestrians, bicycles, anything that moves. We're actually taking that into consideration to make sure the infrastructure is in place for all those multiple modes of transportation. And we primarily do this through a traffic impact analysis or study. That's the method by which we are able to analyze the merits of a new project and its impacts on the surrounding community and the infrastructure. We always make sure that we're following the Peoria engineering standards as outlined in the PESM, P-E-S-M, the Peoria Engineering Standards Manual, as well as other federal and state guidelines. When we're reviewing capital programs, we want to look at reviewing the roads for proper signing and striping. We want to look at the traffic signals to make sure we're installing the correct equipment and it's consistent with the city standards across the city. And we also want to take into consideration transit needs, both current and future. One example would be making sure that we're constructing bus bays on the far side of signalized intersections even before a transit route is established. So the traffic impact analysis, we review several items in order to judge the merits of a new development. One of the big items is the level of service, or LOS, and that's a grade A through F analysis of an access point that measures the level of delay at any particular intersection. So what we're really shooting for is to make sure that we're at least at a level of service D that would indicate some level of delay, but it's a reasonable delay. Anytime we see a development that comes in with access with worse than level D, say an E or an F, we want that development to find some way to mitigate that impact so it's bringing it up to a better level of service or possibly eliminate the access entirely. We look at this through access control. There should be a limited number of access points to any development, and we also want to control where those points are, especially on arterial streets and parkways, where you want to minimize the number of interaction points between the vehicles to make sure that safety is a strong consideration as well as access. One of the other main points we look at is deceleration lanes, also known as right turn lanes, and this is primarily so vehicles can slow to an appropriate speed when they're turning into a driveway to minimize the chances of rear-ending from vehicles that may be traveling at higher speeds on the adjacent roadway. We also, of course, look at the intersections nearby for warrants for a traffic signal. If it's appropriate because of the impacts of a development, then it is appropriate for the development to either fully fund or partially fund construction of a new traffic signal. So that's analyzed as part of this TIA review as well to see if it's appropriate at the time. And finally, it's particularly important for schools, and we're finding more and more in cases of certain drive-thrus, such as popular coffee locations. We need to look at the queuing analysis. And queuing is just a word that means stacking. The vehicles that are lined up, as you can see for a school especially, parents lined up at the end of the school day, are they accommodated safely on site? Or if they're not accommodated on site and they're spilling onto the street, is it obstructing traffic or is it doing so in a safe manner? So the traffic studies that we do beyond the planning stage, so we put a lot of our heart and soul into the planning stages because we get to live with the infrastructure after it's constructed. So we never get to wipe our hands and move along. We have to live with all of our decisions. So we continually analyze the safety and functions of our streets on an ongoing basis. And we primarily do this with two big tools. One is through crash analysis, which is provided, the crash reports are reported by the Arizona Department of Transportation, and we get to see if there are hot spots that are popping up throughout the city. Are there certain specific types of crashes that are occurring? Where are they occurring? When? These are things that are very important for us to maybe identify the cause of some of those problems. We also look at the speed and volume counts on our arterial and collector streets, and these are things that we collect on an annual basis, and there's a tool we use. It's actually available to the public now. We're really excited about it. It's an online interactive map that's available on our traffic webpage, and anyone can go on this, just zoom into the city, click around on the different streets with the colored line segments and see what the latest count was, how many vehicles there were, and what the speeds were, as well as what the posted speed is. It's very valuable for us for looking at how our streets are operating and if there are any possible remedies or changes that we might want to consider. So, of course, the big one that everyone asks for is traffic signals. We do analyze signals for warrants for traffic signals, and there are federal warrants that dictate minimum standards by which minimum warrants that have to be met before we even consider a traffic signal. Now, that's not to say if we meet one or more warrants for a traffic signal, we're obligated to install a signal. In fact, it's quite different. We need to look very seriously that even if a location does meet those warrants, is it appropriate? Because not all locations that meet those warrants are necessarily appropriate or properly spaced. So we have to take serious consideration when we are looking at it to make sure it is still appropriate, unless there's something, there could be other things that we could look at as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about access control because limiting turning movements or limiting driveway access is, for example, if we construct a new median on a street, driveways that may have previously had full movement access would now be limited. There is an impact to that for access, yes, but there's also a safety component if it's necessary, and this is often the case on arterial and parkways, where by limiting access, you're improving safety and the efficiency of the corridor. We also get requests for all-way stops, and the one thing I do want to say about all-way stops is we have to make sure that it's needed for stop controls. Basically, you need to determine who has right-of-way at an intersection. We can never install these for speed control, and that's actually dictated by, again, also the federal government. So generally speaking, we need approximately equal volumes of traffic on all the approaches, because remember, when we install a stop sign, we're telling all drivers you have to come to a complete and total stop when you come to the intersection. So we need to make sure that we're judicious when we are installing these stop controls, because they're very restrictive. Now that's the here and now and the ongoing, but we also don't want to neglect the long term. So we can maybe head off some of those complications at the pass. And we had a good example of that earlier today when we had discussions of haciendas, looking at long-range planning. The circulation map is that tool that identifies the arterial and collector streets, not only as they exist today, but as we see them in the future. And not only in Peoria, but all of our neighboring communities as well. How do you get from one side of the valley to the other? It's crucial that we work together to identify those appropriate routes. But we talk a lot about vehicles. And while vehicular transportation is very important, we certainly don't want to neglect the other modes of transportation. We collectively call active human transportation, or we say active transportation. We basically mean pedestrians, bicycles, unicycles, tricycles, Dr. Seuss, Fuzzy-Wig, any kind of human-powered device would fall under active transportation. And we want to make sure that those other users have just as much access and opportunity as motor vehicles do. And let's also not forget transit. Transit is getting bigger and bigger in Peoria, and we really want to foster that and make sure that the infrastructure is there and in place for when we do have more opportunities to expand our transit transportation. We have a couple of other opportunities too that we call them optionals that are available to citizens as a quality of life option. And they can really be summed up as speed humps to help control speed and parking restrictions. So for speed humps, we do have a qualification where we have to conduct a speed study to determine that there is actually a speeding concern on a local street. And if the thresholds are met, typically it's 5 miles an hour over the posted speed limit, there's a petition process by which people can request the speed humps. Similarly, with no parking signs, we have no real criteria other than a request coming from someone on a street saying we would like to request parking restrictions. Usually it's impact from schools. That's the most common cause for requests for no parking signs. And we also have a petition process by which 80% of the residents on the affected street say, yes, we agree to have these parking restrictions. The caveat is it applies to everyone. It's not resident permit parking. It's everybody or nobody when the parking restrictions are in place. So there is a trade-off to it. But both of these are available to residents as quality of life at no cost to them. It's provided by the city if they have the appropriate level of neighborhood support. We also do a lot of work with schools. Schools have a huge impact on traffic around neighborhoods in particular. So while we look at queuing when new schools are coming in for development, we also look at them on an ongoing basis, and we work with schools to develop circulation plans that either minimize the impact to the neighborhood, better organize schools, find ways to legally accommodate all those parent vehicles. And one of the other methods that we utilize that helps us develop circulation plans is first by knowing where those walking kids are and where those driving parents are. So by developing walking maps in conjunction with the school, that also helps us identify the best locations for the crosswalks. So it's a great partnership we have, not only with Peoria Unified School District and the Deer Valley Unified School District, but also our individual charter schools, charter and private schools as well. Finally, the core meat of what you think of when you think of traffic engineering is signs and markings. That's all of the speed limit signs, the warning signs, crosswalks, and stripes in the roadway. We are responsible for that as well. And traffic signals, which would cover all of the ITS components, intelligent transportation systems, the fiber optic network, and all the technology that goes into it. And rather than me muddle through describing what it is. We'd rather show it to you. So at this point, we'd actually like to end this portion of the presentation and invite you to join us over in the Traffic Management Center for our tour guided by Steve McKenzie, our our ITS engineer.
Would it be okay if we ask some questions while they may be fresh in our mind right now before we break for the tour? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Do we have time to do that? Great. So I want to ask if there's, okay, Commissioner Alsop, do you have a question?
Yeah, a couple times you referenced guidelines from the federal government. That's new to me. How is the federal government enforcing? What's their leverage? Is it through funding? Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Primarily, it would be through the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is our Bible that dictates how we use signs and markings, traffic signals, and we have an obligation to follow that guideline. That document was adopted by the state. If we do not follow that guidance, then we are definitely subject to severe liability concerns. So it's for our own liability and standard engineering practice that we follow that manual and other similar manuals and requirements.
Okay, thank you.
And let me jump in here, Chair and Commissioners. There's other manuals. There's manuals on how we construct signals, and there are cantilevers going over the road, so we got to make sure they're structurally sound. There's federal criteria on that. There's federal criteria on horizontal and vertical curves of roadways at particular speeds, so folks who are driving at 50 miles an hour is hitting a curve on a road at an appropriate radius so they don't lose control. So these are dictated by federal guidelines and manuals that we follow.
So it's the city and the state adopting that guideline, basically adhering yourself to.
Yeah, so the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices is a manual produced by the Federal Highway Administration, which has been adopted by the state of Arizona and also adopted by the city of Peoria. And that, again, that's the premier manual that we use. And it talks about signal warrants, where traffic signals will be warranted, where we should put traffic signals, but it also talks about signs and markings. And the reason why that's important is when you're in Arizona, you want a stop sign look the same as if you go to California or New Mexico. It has to be consistent across the board. And that's what that manual does for us.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Commissioner Condi?
I have so many questions. One is, the big thing, maybe 10 years ago, which is safer, having a lagging left or turning immediately right? I'd love to know. I never did get any definition at that, and I see both. So that was one. And two, can technology work so that, and it seems to work on Thunderbird, if you make one light and you travel consistent speed, you can make all the lights all the way through Thunderbird. But if you don't make that first light, or you go faster or slower, you are doomed to stop at every single light. And the same with Grand. Grand can be either, all right, this is 30 years ago. If you traveled above the speed limit on Grand and traveled 50 miles an hour, and you hit the first light, you could sail down Grand. But if you went to the speed limit, you were at every light. So that was 30 years ago. I can't be caught for that, and I'm not admitting to doing that. But anyway, what about those things? So you can judge how many, because sometimes we sit there and we're at a traffic light and it never changes and there's no traffic, and we're doing a left-hand turn and nothing happens and a minute goes by. Can you address those issues?
Chair Nelson and Commissioners, absolutely. And some of the explanation will actually could show you in the Traffic Management Center, but I heard three questions, so let me see if I got all three. Leading left turns versus lagging left turns.
Right.
And which one's safer? And really, the safer movement is to protect the left turns, and regardless if it's leading or lagging. So what we do as a group is, remember Mr. Forey identified that we look at hotspots locations, and we just recently made a change at 91st Avenue in Northern, because that was a hotspot. And what was a hotspot for? We had a lot of left turns during the day, left turn accidents during the day at all approaches. So what do? We protected the left turns during the day, and we go flashing in the evenings and on the weekends. to address the accidents. And those are the type of engineering decisions we're making based on the accident analysis. The reason why we go leading or lagging really depends on the platoon of traffic if the left turn is blocked by the through movement. For example, at 91st Avenue and Olive, if you go westbound, we lag that left turn, and the reason being is a short left turn pocket and there's a raised median, and usually you miss the left turn arrow if it was leading. So we lag it, so let the cars go through, you get in your left turn pocket, all the left turners are ready to go, then we lag it, you hit your turn.
Okay,
And so it just depends on operation more so than if it's safer. If it's safety is the concern, we're actually looking at protecting the left turn.
okay.
Okay. The second thing that I heard was progression. You're traveling the speed limit. How come I can't hit all the traffic signals? And it's tough to progress two-way traffic on a system when you have signals spaced less than a half mile apart.
Okay,
And so in congested areas like a Thunderbird, where you got lots of signals, 83rd, 84th Drive, the freeway, it's tough because we can't progress two-way traffic because the spacing doesn't work. I may be able to go one direction for progression, but I won't be able to do the other direction.
got it.
So that's why when we review projects for development, we're really looking at spacing of where are we going to allow full access, because we have to be prepared that could be a potential signal in the future if a lot of commercial comes in and it becomes pretty tough for that left turn to get out. We may be asked to put in a signal, it may be warranted, it may not be at the right spot. So the consequence of putting that signal in is delay on the main thoroughfare.
Got it.
But the benefit of putting that signal in is the side street could get out easier. And so those are the juggling acts that we do as traffic engineers.
Okay,
And the last thing I heard was that you wait for your left turn forever, why is it not changing?
yes,
And so there's two ways to progress a corridor. And Steve McKenzie will talk about this a little bit. We do time of day progression where, we're trying to get, Lake Pleasant Parkway is a great example. We try to progress Lake Pleasant Parkway southbound during the morning and northbound in the evening. And so if you're going in southbound in the evening on Lake Pleasant Parkway, yeah, you could wait for a while, because what our intent is we're not really serving the left turns, we're not really serving the side streets, we're really trying to focus on the platooning of Lake Pleasant Parkway. It even may mean that someone's waiting on a left turn, you don't see the platoon coming, because there's a set time frame that we're going to allow that left turn.
got it.
The other thing that we've been doing a lot in this city, more so than other cities, is running our signals free. And what does that mean? It's not really tied to another signal upstream and downstream. It's really measuring, determining if there's a car waiting. It's called actuation on the side street.
Okay.
And we got minimum times for the main street, and if it detects that car, it will turn more quickly than you do if something's progressed. Great example is 85th and Peoria. We just changed that to free. It's just right over here. If you go out there and you're waiting for a left turn, it turns pretty quickly.
Okay,
And so those are some of the ideas of traffic signal progression that Steve McKenzie will be able to show in the Traffic Management Center, which I'm telling you is the magic. That's the show that I hope that we could get there and have enough time to answer all the questions there too.
okay. Really interesting.
Commissioner Hutchinson, you have a question? Go ahead.
And depending on who's, I guess the electronic guy would be the one to answer. Is there any accommodations being made today, work being done to accommodate automated driving, things like that, make it safer on the local streets?
Chair Nelson and Commissioners, I can answer that, but I'm going to punt that to the expert in the Traffic Management Center when we start the tour.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Patterson?
Yeah, I was just wondering how the adaptive traffic control is working on Bell Road, and if you're going to get into that other parts of the city.
And Chair Nelson and Commissioners, great subject, it's working well. Steve McKenzie, who's the ITS engineer, was heavily involved with the county on that, and I'll ask him to talk about it at the Traffic Management Center.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from commissioners? Okay, well, thank you. We're going to step away for a tour now of the Traffic Management Center, and I'm going to recess the meeting to allow for that tour, and then we'll reconvene afterwards. All right, I'd like to reconvene the September 5th, 2019 meeting of the Peoria Planning and Zoning Commission. Again, on behalf of the commission, thank you for that presentation and tour. Very interesting. I think we all enjoyed that. Definitely impressive, and one more reason to be proud to live in Peoria. All right, any other questions about what we just saw before we move on? All right, we're going to march ahead then. The next agenda item is call to the public. Are there any comments from the public on non-agenda items? I assume not. We haven't received any requests for, okay. Next will be reports from staff. Staff, please present your report.
Thank you. So in light of our open meeting law, the director has appointed me as acting director right now to provide reports from staff this evening. All right, so a couple things. We are back in council chambers September 19th. Don't get too comfortable because the general plan meeting, we need to be off-site for the first one. So October 3rd, I would invite you to the Rio Vista Recreation Center. That is our remote meeting, discussion only on the major general plan. We may have other items on there as well. And then we are back on October 17th in council chambers. And so that would conclude reports from staff. Thank you.
Great, thank you for your report. Next is Planning and Zoning Commission updates and report of current events. Do any commissioners have any updates or current events to report? All right, seeing none. We're going to see no further business. I call a meeting adjourned.
Has always been to focus on the highest utilizers of the system, but this time around in the grant, we're also going to focus on those folks that